In the heart of a desolate landscape, where the whispers of the wind sounded more like mournful sighs, stood the crumbling edifice of what was once the Newbridge Mental Hospital. Its once stately walls, now victims of time and neglect, bore the scars of forgotten stories and untold sufferings. It was a place that the locals steered clear of, a place where the past seemed to seep through the cracks in the walls, and the air was heavy with an unshakable chill of despair. Into this forlorn backdrop arrived Gordon Fleming, a man whose pragmatic demeanor and rugged appearance belied a keen mind that thrived on challenge and adventure. Gordon was the head of an asbestos cleaning crew, a group of individuals who were more accustomed to battling physical hazards than confronting the eerie silences of an abandoned asylum. Their task was straightforward. Cleanse the building of its toxic past so it could be demolished, erasing its blemish from the town's landscape. As Gordon stood at the threshold, a clipboard in hand, he couldn't shake off a peculiar sensation, a whispering touch of unease that seemed to emanate from the hollow eyes of the broken windows. He dismissed the feeling as a trick of the mind, a natural reaction to the hospital's dilapidated state and the stories that had become part of its architecture. After all, they were here for a job, not to indulge in local folklore or let their imaginations get the better of them. But as the crew crossed the threshold, their footsteps echoing through the empty halls, each man could feel the oppressive weight of the air, as if the very walls were reluctant to let go of their secrets. It was as though the hospital was a living entity, its pulse slow but palpable, its breath a cold draft that sent shivers down their spines. In that moment, Gordon made a silent vow to lead his crew through this job swiftly and efficiently. Little did he know that the Newbridge Mental Hospital had its own agenda, and the echoes of its dark past were not ready to be silenced. The crew was about to embark on a journey that would blur the lines between reality and madness, a journey where the echoes of the asylum would resonate in their own minds, challenging their sanity and revealing horrors that lay hidden beneath the veil of time. As Gordon flipped the first page on his clipboard, the stillness of the hospital was broken by the distant sound of something stirring, a subtle reminder that in the depths of the abandoned corridors, the past was very much alive, waiting to be awakened. The prologue to their ordeal had just begun, and the echoes of the asylum were ready to tell their tale. Gordon Fleming led his crew through the rusted gates of the Newbridge Mental Hospital, with a sense of purpose that masked his inner reservations. The sight of the imposing structure, with its peeling paint and boarded-up windows, seemed to cast a shadow over the team's morale. The hospital was a relic of an era when mental health was grossly misunderstood, its walls a silent testament to the innumerable tragedies that must have unfolded within. The team was a motley crew, each member carrying his own set of tools and personal baggage. There was Mike, the jokester, always ready with a quip to lighten the mood. Sarah, the team's only woman, bore a look of determination that made it clear she wasn't to be underestimated. Then there was Alex, young and somewhat naive, viewing the job as an adventure, oblivious to the gravity of the setting. Their footsteps echoed through the deserted hallways, stirring up dust that seemed to have been undisturbed for decades. The air was thick with the stench of mold and decay, a tangible reminder of the building's abandonment. Gordon's flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing the remnants of what once was faded murals on the walls, broken furniture, and doors hanging off their hinges. As they ventured deeper, the silence was oppressive, almost tangible. It was as if the hospital was holding its breath, watching the intruders with unseen eyes. The crew's chatter gradually diminished, a wordless agreement that silence was somehow appropriate, respectful even, in the presence of such palpable history. It was in the East Wing, far from the entrance and the comfort of natural light, that they found it. A door, different from the others, sturdy, metallic, and with a modern lock that seemed out of place amidst the decay. It piqued their curiosity. Gordon, with years of experience behind him, hesitated. This part of the hospital was not on their work plan, but the mystery was too compelling to ignore. With a collective effort, they managed to force the door open, the screeching of metal against metal reverberating through the silent halls like a scream. Inside, they found a small room, barren except for a dusty shelf that held a series of old tapes and a decrepit tape player. The labels were faded, the handwriting barely legible, but one thing was clear, these tapes were recordings of therapy sessions. The crew looked at each other, a silent question in the air. The curiosity was universal, the decision unanimous. Mike dusted off the tape player, plugged it into a portable generator, and with a collective breath held, pushed play. The crackle of static filled the room before a calm, clinical voice began to narrate. The voice spoke of a patient, one with a complex psyche, hinting at a mind fractured by trauma and time. The crew listened, transfixed, as the voice detailed sessions with this enigmatic individual, whose personality seemed to shift with unsettling ease. But as the tape played, a subtle shift began to occur. The air grew colder, the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen, and the crew felt an inexplicable sense of dread creeping into their bones. It was as if the act of playing the tapes had awakened something, a presence that had been lying dormant, biding its time. Gordon, ever the pragmatist, was the first to shake off the feeling. He reminded the crew of their purpose, their schedule, and the need to maintain professionalism. Reluctantly, the team agreed, turning off the tape player and stepping out of the room, but the chill that had settled over them refused to dissipate. As they continued their work, the hospital seemed to respond to their intrusion. Unexplained noises echoed through the hallways, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere and yet everywhere. Shadows flickered at the edge of their vision, and an unshakable feeling of being watched settled over the crew. It was clear that the Newbridge Mental Hospital was not just a backdrop for their work, but an active participant, its echoes seeping into their minds, reshaping their reality. And as the day came to an end and the crew gathered their tools, the unease that gripped them was a clear sign that the job was more than just a battle against asbestos and decay. They were contending with the echoes of the asylum, echoes that refused to be silenced. The next morning, under a gray, overcast sky, the crew returned to the Newbridge Mental Hospital with a sense of unease they couldn't quite shake off. The building loomed before them, as if it had grown even more menacing overnight. Gordon noticed the hesitance in his team's steps, their quick, nervous glances. He knew he had to keep them focused, remind them that they were here for a job, not to get tangled up in the building's dark lore. But the discovery of the tapes had added an unexpected layer to their task. The recordings were an eerie reminder of the hospital's grim past, and despite Gordon's efforts to keep the team on track, there was an unspoken agreement to continue listening to them during their breaks. The curiosity was too strong, the pull of the unknown too enticing. As they resumed their work, the tape player once again filled the room with the static-laced voice of the therapist, delving deeper into the psyche of the mysterious patient. The sessions revealed a mind like a labyrinth, with personalities so distinct and vivid they felt almost tangible. There was the protector, a personality that spoke with authority and calm, the child, whose innocence was heartbreaking, and the shadow, a presence so dark it made the crew's skin crawl. With each tape, the atmosphere within the hospital seemed to change. The air grew heavier, the silence deeper, punctuated only by the unsettling sounds of their own breathing, and the distant, unexplained noises that seemed to follow them. Shadows danced just out of sight, and more than once, Gordon caught his crew members glancing over their shoulders, their faces pale and drawn. It wasn't just the building that was changing, the crew felt it within themselves. Sleep became elusive, filled with nightmares that lingered long after waking. Conversations dwindled, replaced by a tense, uneasy quiet. Even the ever-jovial Mike lost his humor, his eyes clouded with a fear he couldn't articulate. Gordon watched his team closely, concern etched into his features. He had seen stress affect people in many ways, but this was different. There was a palpable sense of dread that clung to them, an emotional echo of the hospital's tormented past that they couldn't seem to escape. As the days passed, the line between the tapes and their reality began to blur. The personalities on the recording seemed to whisper to them from the shadows, their words intertwining with the crew's thoughts. The hospital's corridors grew oppressive, as if they were constricting around them, a physical manifestation of the mental turmoil they were experiencing. Gordon knew they couldn't continue like this. The job, once a routine task, had become a battle for their sanity. He made the decision to gather the crew, to address the growing fear head-on, and reclaim the rational, logical minds that they needed to finish their work. But as he called them together, a sudden, chilling realization hit him. The tapes, with their fragmented tales of a shattered mind, were not just relics of the past. They were a warning, a mirror reflecting the potential fate of anyone who delved too deep into the asylum's shadows. And as the crew gathered, their faces etched with lines of stress and fear, Gordon understood that the echoes of the asylum were not confined to the tapes. They were resonating through the halls, through the very walls of the hospital, and most terrifyingly, through each of them. The task ahead was not just to clean the building, but to somehow cleanse themselves of the darkness that the Newbridge Mental Hospital had insidiously woven into their souls. As the days wore on, the distinction between day and night began to blur within the confines of the Newbridge Mental Hospital. The team worked tirelessly, but the usual satisfaction of a job progressing was notably absent. Instead, a pervasive feeling of dread hung in the air, thick and unyielding. The crew's movements were mechanical, their interactions minimal and strained. Gordon, who had always prided himself on his rationality, found his resolve wavering. The whispers of the hospital were incessant, a constant murmur in the back of his mind. He caught snippets of conversations, soft and indistinct, as if the walls themselves were speaking. At first, he dismissed them as figments of his imagination, a natural response to the stress in the eerie environment. But as the whispers grew louder, more insistent, he could no longer ignore them. The team's morale was at an all-time low. Sarah, usually so stoic and unflappable, confided in Gordon that she felt watched, that sometimes she'd turn a corner and swear she saw a figure disappearing just out of sight. Alex's usual bright demeanor had dimmed, his youthful enthusiasm replaced by a quiet, haunted look. Even Mike, the team's pillar of strength and humor, had grown silent, his jokes replaced by a tight-lipped determination to just get through the day. It was during a late evening, as the dim light of the setting sun cast long shadows through the broken windows, that the situation escalated. The crew was packing up their equipment when a loud crash echoed through the hallways, followed by an eerie silence. Heartbeats quickened, breaths held, the team froze, their eyes locking on Gordon for direction. With a nod from Gordon, they cautiously approached the source of the noise, only to find a hallway they had cleaned just hours before now littered with debris. But it was not the mess that stopped them in their tracks, it was the wall. There, scrawled across it in what looked like charcoal, were words that sent chills down their spines. "Can't you hear us?" The message was clear, undeniable. The hospital was communicating with them, its voices no longer confined to whispers in the shadows, but manifesting into the physical world. The boundary between the living and whatever lingered in the hospital was thinning, tearing at the edges. That night, no one spoke of leaving. It was as if the hospital had them in its grip, a morbid fascination to understand, to uncover the truth, keeping them tethered to its decaying halls. But as they left the building, each felt the unseen eyes of the hospital upon them, its whispers following them into the night. Back at the makeshift camp they had set up outside the hospital's grounds, the crew sat in silence. The usual banter, the sounds of camaraderie, were absent. Instead, there was only the crackling of the fire and the distant, unexplainable sounds of the hospital door slamming shut, the faint echo of laughter, or perhaps crying, it was impossible to tell. Gordon knew they were at a breaking point. The job, the hospital, the tapes, it was all converging into a nightmare that they were living, awake or asleep. He needed to make a decision, for the safety of his team and perhaps for their sanity. But as he looked into the fire, he couldn't shake the feeling that the decision was no longer entirely his to make. The hospital, with its echoing corridors and whispering walls, had a will of its own, and it was pulling them, inexorably, into its dark heart. The days that followed marked a descent into a realm where the lines between the tangible and the unseen, the past and the present, began to blur. The crew's task, once purely physical, had morphed into a psychological odyssey, each turn in the hospital's labyrinthine corridors, leading them deeper into an abyss of the mind. Gordon watched his team with a growing sense of alarm. The fatigue was evident in their every movement, a physical manifestation of the mental burden they bore. The hospital's oppressive presence was like a weight on their shoulders, a constant reminder that they were trespassers in a domain that begrudged their intrusion. As they continued to listen to the tapes, the narrative that unfolded was as complex as the mind it depicted. The patient, whose voice had become a haunting soundtrack to their days, seemed to exist in a realm beyond their understanding. Each personality revealed on the tapes was distinct, yet intertwined with the others in a macabre dance of psyche and memory. The most disturbing revelations came from the Shadow, a personality that spoke in riddles and veiled threats. Its sessions were the hardest to endure, leaving the crew feeling exposed and vulnerable, as if the Shadow was not just a fragment of a long-gone patient's mind, but a living, breathing presence among them. It was during one of these sessions that the crew stumbled upon a room that was not on any of the hospital's blueprints. Hidden behind a false wall, it was a stark, sterile space that contrasted sharply with the decay elsewhere. The room was an enigma, its purpose unclear, but the sense of dread it evoked was unmistakable. In the center of the room stood a chair, its straps worn and frayed, a silent sentinel to the horrors that had occurred there. On the floor, arranged in a precise circle around the chair, were a series of photographs. Each image was a study in terror, capturing moments of agony and fear that transcended time, reaching out to ensnare the viewer's soul. The discovery was a turning point. The hospital's secrets were unraveling, revealing a darkness that was all-consuming. The unethical experiments, the suffering inflicted in the name of science, it all began to form a picture that was as horrifying as it was compelling. The crew's resolve began to fracture, their minds strained to the breaking point by the weight of the horrors they had uncovered. Gordon, once the pillar of strength, felt the fissures growing within his own psyche. The voices, the shadows, the whispers, they were all becoming a part of him, a chorus of madness that threatened to drown out his own thoughts. But it was not just the past that haunted them. The hospital seemed to be reliving its darkest moments, the echoes of agony and despair, manifesting in ways that defied explanation. Tools disappeared only to reappear in impossible places, messages appeared on walls only to vanish without a trace, and the air was filled with the scent of fear, so tangible it was almost suffocating. Gordon knew they could not endure much more. The hospital, with its echoing halls and shadowed rooms, was consuming them, its history bleeding into their reality. They were becoming a part of its narrative, characters in a story that had no end, only an eternal repetition of torment and madness. As the crew gathered, their faces hollow, their eyes haunted, Gordon realized that the choice was no longer theirs to make. The Newbridge Mental Hospital had claimed them, its echoes resonating within their very souls. The question was no longer whether they could leave, but whether they could ever truly escape, even if they managed to walk out of its doors. The unraveling had begun, and the fabric of their reality was tearing apart, thread by thread. In the heart of the Newbridge Mental Hospital, time seemed to stand still. The crew, now mere shadows of their former selves, moved through the corridors with a sense of inevitability, as if each step was preordained. The boundary between the hospital's tragic history and their present reality was dissolving, each moment a reflection of the other. Gordon, once a man of action and decisiveness, found himself adrift in a sea of doubt and fear. The tapes, with their fragmented tales of a mind broken by despair, continued to play, a haunting soundtrack that seemed to echo the crew's own spiraling thoughts. The discovery of the hidden room and its macabre contents had been a catalyst, a grim revelation that had shattered any remaining illusions of detachment. It was in this state of collective vulnerability that they uncovered the records. Tucked away in a forgotten filing cabinet, the yellowed pages bore witness to the hospital's darkest chapter. The files were meticulous, a chilling testament to the clinical detachment with which the experiments had been conducted. The patients, reduced to mere numbers, had been subjected to treatments that pushed the boundaries of ethics and humanity. The record spoke of induced dissociation, of fractured psyches molded by the hands of those who played at being gods. And at the center of it all was the patient from the tapes, Patient Zero, whose multiple personalities were not a pre-existing condition, but the result of the hospital's twisted experiments. As Gordon and his crew pored over the documents, the reality of what they had uncovered settled over them like a shroud. The hospital was not just a place of healing gone wrong, but a site of unimaginable horrors, a place where the line between treatment and torture had been irrevocably blurred. The revelations took a toll on the crew, each member grappling with the weight of the truth in their own way. Sarah's resolve turned to anger, a burning need to expose the hospital's sins to the world. Mike's humor, long since faded, was replaced by a deep, simmering rage. Alex, the youngest among them, was lost in a maze of fear and confusion, his innocence shattered by the darkness he had witnessed. But it was the effect on Gordon that was the most profound. The hospital's echoes, its whispers and shadows, had found a home within him. The lines between his thoughts and the hospital's influence were blurring, the voices of the past indistinguishable from his own. As the days passed, the crew began to experience a fracturing of their own. Their perceptions altered, reality warping around them in ways that defied explanation. The hospital's corridors seemed to shift, leading them in circles, trapping them in an endless loop of horror and despair. The realization that they were reliving the patient's trauma, that the hospital's dark past was somehow replaying itself through them, was a revelation too terrifying to comprehend. They were no longer just uncovering the hospital's history, they were becoming a part of it, the latest victims in a story that had no end, only an eternal echo of pain and madness. As Gordon looked at his crew, their faces etched with fear and exhaustion, he knew that they were reaching a breaking point. The hospital, with its endless corridors and whispered secrets, was closing in on them, its history a living entity that refused to be forgotten. The echoes of the past were not just haunting them, they were consuming them, and their only hope of salvation lay in uncovering the truth, no matter how horrifying it might be. The atmosphere within the Newbridge Mental Hospital had shifted imperceptibly, the air charged with a palpable sense of foreboding. The crew, once driven by a shared purpose, now found themselves ensnared in a web of fear and uncertainty, each step forward a descent deeper into the hospital's dark embrace. Gordon, his mind a battleground between reason and the creeping tendrils of madness, struggled to maintain a semblance of leadership. The hospital's grip on them was unyielding, its whispers a constant murmur in his ears, its shadows a flickering presence at the edge of his vision. The line between the living and the spectral had blurred, the hospital itself a nexus where past and present collided with chilling consequences. The crew's encounters with the unexplainable had escalated, each incident more terrifying than the last. Objects moved of their own accord, their movements deliberate, menacing. shadows took form, coalescing into figures that vanished when approached. The whispers grew into voices, their words a mix of pleas and threats, their tone chillingly familiar. It was as if the hospital was awakening, its long-dormant energy fueled by the crew's presence, their emotions a catalyst for phenomena that defied all logic. The building's tortured history was not just a backdrop for their ordeal, but an active participant, its every corridor, every room, a stage for a haunting that was both spectral and psychological. Gordon could see the toll it was taking on his team. Sarah's anger had turned to paranoia, her every word a testament to a mind on the brink. Mike's rage had given way to a hollow resignation, his once vibrant spirit dimmed by the darkness that enveloped them. Alex, lost and terrified, seemed to shrink with each passing day, his youth no match for the horrors they faced. But it was within Gordon that the change was most profound. The tapes, the patient's fragmented voices, had become a chorus in his mind, their narratives intertwining with his own thoughts, until he could no longer distinguish where one ended and the other began. The hospital's past, its suffering and madness, echoed in his soul, a resonance that threatened to consume him. As the crew pushed forward, driven by a desperate need to find answers, to find a way out, the hospital seemed to sense their intent. The occurrences intensified, a maelstrom of paranormal activity that defied all reason. The building itself seemed to be against them, its walls closing in, its very structure a labyrinth designed to entrap and disorient. In a moment of chilling clarity, Gordon understood the true nature of the threat they faced. The hospital, with its echoing halls and shadowed rooms, was more than just a building. It was an entity, its foundations soaked in tragedy and pain, its walls imbued with the echoes of the past. And it was alive, its every brick, every shattered windowpane, a testament to a history that refused to be forgotten, a presence that would not be ignored. The crew, with their every move watched, their every thought influenced, were not just cleaning the hospital. They were part of a narrative that had been unfolding long before they arrived, a narrative that the hospital was determined to continue. The unseen threat was not just the paranormal occurrences that haunted them, but the realization that they were not in control, that they were mere pawns in a game that had no rules, only the inexorable pull of the past, reaching out to claim them as its own. In the suffocating grip of the Newbridge Mental Hospital, time seemed to unravel, its passage marked not by the clock, but by the ebb and flow of the crew's sanity. Gordon, his resolve crumbling under the weight of the hospital's oppressive presence, felt the last threads of his rational mind fraying, the boundaries between reality and nightmare indistinguishably blurred. The tapes, once a source of morbid curiosity, had become an anchor to a past too horrific to fully comprehend. The final tape, its real and ominous presence, sat unplayed, its secrets locked within the magnetic strips. With trembling hands, Gordon placed the tape into the player, the click of the mechanism echoing like a gunshot in the silence. As the tape hissed to life, a voice spoke, not the clinical tone of the therapist, but a new voice, raw and filled with agony. It was the voice of Patient Zero, the epicenter of the hospital's dark history. The voice spoke of the experiments, of the pain and terror, of a mind shattered by forces beyond understanding. And it spoke of the hospital, not as a building, but as a living entity, a being forged from suffering and madness. The crew listened, their faces ghostly in the flickering light, as the voice detailed the hospital's final experiment, the creation of a psychic nexus, a focal point for the energy that permeated its walls. Patient Zero was the nexus, the vessel into which the hospital's dark energy was channeled, a living conduit for the agony of countless souls. But the experiment had not ended with the closing of the hospital. The energy, once unleashed, could not be contained. It lingered, a malevolent presence waiting for a new focus, a new vessel. And the crew, with their presence, their emotions, had provided the catalyst for the hospital's dark legacy to continue. As the tape reached its end, a palpable silence enveloped the room. The revelation was clear and terrifying. The hospital, with its whispered voices and shifting shadows, was not haunting them, it was claiming them, drawing them into its fold, continuing its experiment through them. The crew, their faces etched with horror, turned to Gordon, their eyes pleading for guidance, for salvation. But Gordon, his mind a whirlwind of despair and understanding, knew that their fate was no longer in their hands. The hospital, a sentient entity born from the darkest reaches of human suffering, had woven them into its narrative, its history repeating not as a memory, but as a living, breathing reality. In a moment of desperate clarity, Gordon realized that their only hope lay in confronting the hospital's core, the heart of the nexus that Patient Zero had become. It was a gamble, a final stand against an entity that defied all logic and reason, but it was the only path that offered even a glimmer of escape from the nightmare. With a determination born from the depths of fear, the crew gathered their resolve. The hospital, with its echoing corridors and unseen eyes, watched as they moved towards the heart of the darkness, towards the epicenter of its power. The shadows seemed to whisper, the air to thicken, as they approached their final confrontation, the revelation of the hospital's true nature, not an end but a beginning, a threshold into a reality where the echoes of the past were not just memories, but a living, breathing presence, ready to claim them as its own. The journey to the heart of the Newbridge Mental Hospital felt like a descent into the depths of the human psyche, each corridor a passage through layers of pain and despair. The crew, bound together by a shared determination to confront the darkness, moved as one, their steps echoing in the oppressive silence. Gordon led the way, his mind a tumult of fear and resolve. The hospital seemed to sense their intent, the atmosphere thickening, the shadows deepening, as if the building itself was bracing for the confrontation. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices that spoke of suffering and madness, their words a chilling reminder of the hospital's dark legacy. As they reached the heart of the nexus, the epicenter of the hospital's psychic energy, the air crackled with a palpable tension. The room was as Patient Zero had described, a stark, sterile space that belied the horrors it had witnessed. In the center stood the chair, its straps frayed and worn, the silent witness to the hospital's final, most horrific experiment. Gordon and his crew gathered around the chair, their faces set in grim determination. They knew what they had to do, to confront the nexus, to break the cycle that the hospital had perpetuated for decades. It was a risk, a final gamble against an enemy that defied all logic and reason, but it was the only chance they had to end the nightmare. With a deep collective breath, they focused their thoughts, their energy, on the nexus. The hospital responded, the air swirling with unseen forces, the walls groaning as if in protest. The voices reached a fever pitch, a torrent of anger and despair that threatened to overwhelm them. But amidst the chaos, there was a moment of clarity, a piercing light that cut through the darkness. The nexus, the focal point of the hospital's energy, began to unravel, the psychic threads that had bound it together coming apart. The hospital's grip weakened, the shadows receding, the voices fading into silence. As the crew emerged from the hospital, the dawn was breaking, the first light of day casting the building in a new, less ominous light. They were changed, each of them bearing the scars of their ordeal. The echoes of the hospital's dark history a part of them now. But they had survived, their confrontation with the nexus breaking the cycle, freeing the hospital from the grip of its past. The Newbridge Mental Hospital, once a nexus of suffering and madness, was silent now, its halls empty, its secrets laid bare. In the aftermath, the crew went their separate ways, each trying to find a way to move forward, to reconcile the horrors they had witnessed with the reality of their everyday lives. Gordon, his leadership and resolve tested to the limits, found solace in the knowledge that they had faced the darkness and emerged victorious, even if the victory was a personal, intangible one. The Newbridge Mental Hospital stood abandoned, a relic of a bygone era, its halls quiet, its rooms empty. But for those who had walked its corridors, who had confronted its echoes, it would never be just a building. It was a reminder of the thin line between sanity and madness, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, and a warning of the darkness that lurks in the depths of the human soul. As the final chapter of their ordeal closed, the echoes of the asylum faded into silence, but their presence, the lessons they had imparted, would resonate for a lifetime, a haunting melody that would never be entirely forgotten. In the quiet that followed the crew's departure, the Newbridge Mental Hospital stood in stark solitude, its dark history a closed chapter, its halls silent witnesses to the battle that had taken place within its walls. The sun rose and set, casting shadows that moved through the empty rooms, a dance of light and darkness that continued unabated, indifferent to the dramas that had unfolded. Gordon Fleming, his face aged beyond his years by the experiences he had endured, often found his thoughts drifting back to the hospital. Despite the passage of time, the memories remained, vivid and haunting, a constant reminder of the thin veil that separates the known from the unknowable. The hospital had changed him, marked him in ways that were invisible but indelible. The crew had dispersed, each member seeking solace in the normalcy of everyday life, but the bonds that had formed in the crucible of the hospital's corridors remained strong. They didn't speak often, but when they did, their conversations were marked by an understanding that went beyond words, a shared recognition of the depths they had explored together. Rumors about the Newbridge Mental Hospital persisted. Stories of strange noises, fleeting shadows, and an oppressive presence circulated among the locals, a folkloric tribute to the building's tormented past. But no one dared to venture close, the hospital's reputation a deterrent to all but the most foolhardy. For Gordon, the hospital was more than just a memory. It was a reminder of the fragility of the mind, the power of fear, and the strength required to confront one's own demons. He knew that the echoes of the asylum would never be truly silenced, that they would continue to resonate in the quiet moments, a haunting melody that lingered in the periphery of his consciousness. As he moved forward with his life, Gordon carried with him the lessons of the Newbridge Mental Hospital. The experience had taught him about the resilience of the human spirit, the courage required to face the darkness, and the importance of holding onto the light, no matter how faint. The hospital itself, its windows boarded up, its doors locked, stood as a monument to the past, a structure defined by the echoes that lingered within its walls. It was a testament to the stories that had unfolded in its embrace, a silent custodian of secrets that would never be fully revealed. And so, the Newbridge Mental Hospital remained, its presence a quiet reminder of the thin line between reality and nightmare, its silence a canvas for the echoes of the past, echoes that would continue to whisper to those who listened, a haunting symphony of the human condition, ever present, ever enduring, ever echoing.
Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed the video. We highly recommend you watch the next video here. Oops. I'm waiting for you to click. Yes, you've clicked. Happy watching.